Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Trasna this evening. I'm delighted to be joined again by Dr. Thomas Leahy. Thomas is a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics and contemporary history at the University of Cardiff. His book, The Intelligence War Against the IRA, was published by Cambridge University Press probably around 2 years ago, I think, at this stage. Over a year ago, Thomas joined us for his first lecture, which was the intelligence war against the IRA in 1975 to 1998, which in almost 200 lectures we've completed here at Trasna at this stage is actually our second most popular lecture with almost 20,000 views. It was extremely popular. Again, we've a big attendance again this evening. So tonight, delighted to welcome Thomas back, and he's going to cover the period 1969 to 1975. Thomas, you're very welcome back to Trasna, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Liam, and really great to be talking to yourselves tonight. Some of you probably, again, if you came along the first time. I am just going to share these slides. They should pop up on the screen in a second. And yeah, great to be talking to yourselves tonight. The plan is I'm going to talk probably then for about 55 minutes and look forward to questions afterwards. I'll stick around for that. So if you've got any questions, feel free to line them up for that part. As Liam was saying, the book, if you're interested, which this is based on, it also covers the later period of conflict, 1975 to 1998 as well. Intelligence War Against the IRA is out now. Let me press start on this slides. This will help. It's out now. Cambridge University Press, paperback, hardback, online. Can't remember the word for this, ebooks, I believe it is, as well. So if you're interested, you can buy it from various outlets as well if you're interested. So I think probably a good place to start with this, the 1969 to 1975 part of the intelligence war is, I'm sure we're all aware of the debates about whether the IRA was pushed into peace by 1998 because of informers and agents like State Knife. But there's a particular debate about this that looks at the 1990 period. So in my book, I explain 4 reasons for why I think the IRA was not pushed into peace by British intelligence by the 1990s. But the interesting thing is, even before 1975, various authors, including, for example, Martin Frampton, John Bew, Ed Maloney, there's a couple of examples, they suggest that British intelligence operations had a significant effect on the IRA's decision to call a prolonged ceasefire also in 1975. So what we're going to do is try and examine that particular question and other questions about the intelligence war's impact on the IRA between 1969 and 1975. And in my view, the evidence available suggests that despite some intelligence setbacks in Belfast in particular for the IRA elsewhere, and to some extent actually in Belfast as well, persisted and in some areas actually escalated its campaign by 1975. And this persistence was a pretty crucial factor in leading to the UK government having ceasefire talks with the Provisional IRA in June, July 1972, and then for a prolonged period in 1975. And indeed, as I'll talk a little bit about tonight, the UK government even attempted by 1975 to get Irish Republicans and Ulster Loyalists, primarily via the UDA, Ulster Defence Association, to agree to a settlement distancing Northern Ireland from the UK in 1975. So really what I think is the key factors here are an armed stalemate and political factors are best accounting for why the ceasefire talks emerged in 1972, but also again in 1975. And we'll also discuss a little bit why these talks failed. Key point to point out at this point is authors including, say, Richard English, Neil O'Doherty, since 1998 have suggested the 1972 and 1975 talks were not due to intelligence pressure. So I'm not the first person to say that, but the point is my book explains in detail why that is. And it does that by examining the intelligence campaign against key IRA brigades before 1975. It does it after 1975 as well, but we're talking about pre-1975 tonight. So by using a range of memoirs, interviews from all different perspectives, in addition to UK and Irish archival papers, I explore intelligence successes and failures against the IRA in its urban heartlands. So primarily we're talking about Belfast and Derry, rural IRA heartlands in this period, really South Armagh, Tyrone and Fermanagh, and also its campaign in England really after 1973. So to give you an idea of structure, so how this is going to work in the next, as I said, 45, 50 minutes or so. Part 1 is all going to be about the British intelligence war against the IRA between 1969 to July 1972. So it's the first half of what I'll talk about. Then we're going to have little subsections for this, which will guide you through, and I'll make you aware of when we're going through each little section so we don't get lost. So the first part, we're going to try and help assess IRA or UK state success at a local level against each other in each period by outlining their overall objectives towards each other in that period. So it's quite important to gauge what's happening locally with the overall objectives of the IRA in British states. So that's what we're going to do in part 1A, first of all, between 1969 and 1972. In part 1B, we're going to look at IRA successes and setbacks in intelligence war, in this case between 1969 and July 1972. And part 1C will explain why the IRA ceasefire was called and it collapsed, first of all, in June, July 1972. Part 2, as you can see on the slide, is going to follow exactly the same structure, but for the later period, 1972 to 1975. So what we'll do is kick off by looking at the intelligence war against the IRA between 1969 and 1972. So we'll do part 1A first. So for this period, I think really I agree with authors, including some of you might have read these books, Peter Taylor's book on the IRA and Richard English's book. The key thing they say, and I agree with, is the IRA called its June-July 1972 ceasefire from a position of strength. What we're going to do in this part is look a little bit more detail about some of the intelligence operations and why they didn't have a major kind of operational effect on the IRA at this point. To demonstrate this as well, let's consider, as I said, first of all, to contextualize this stuff, what the IRA and UK state were actually trying to achieve against each other by June 1972. So we have a look at British policy between August 1969 to July 1972. So with this period, I do agree with work by academics such as Hugh Bennett, Peter Neumann, about why the British government decided to work with the Ulster Unionist majority rule at Stormont until March 1972. So why they didn't prorogue Stormont until after March 1972. So the reasons they give, and I agree with as well, is first, the British government did not want to trigger a Unionist revolt and an all-out civil war. And that was partly because, obviously, they wanted to avoid a civil war for international reputational reasons, but also here, that was partly because Northern Irish votes had very little impact on Westminster. But occasionally, which obviously we've seen in recent time with Theresa May's government, with the DUP, sometimes they can help back numbers up in Westminster. Generally, that doesn't happen. So Westminster arithmetic doesn't need Northern Irish parties to integrate into that really for governments. Also, what's interesting here, Richard Aldrich and Rory Cormack, they've written a book called The Black Door about Number 10 and secret intelligence. What's interesting here, they also suggest that Edward Heath's Conservative government became, and this is generally not just the Northern Ireland, this is a quote, increasingly obsessed with subversion from domestic enemies, end quote, and that included trade unions and the IRA. So it gives you a sense why they didn't have any semblance up to March 1972 of talking to the IRA. What is interesting is there's a little caveat to what I've just said, and that's that the Unionist reaction to the Lord Hunt report altered the Labour government's initial promotion of civil rights reforms, which they were doing initially in the 1969 period. So Lord Hunt's report was published in October 1969, and it looked at security measures and why there'd been an outbreak of conflict in Northern Ireland. And it recommended disbanding the Ulster Special Constabulary, which nationalists nicknamed the B Specials, which was a backup organisation for the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force in Northern Ireland pre the 2000s. So clashes between the British Army and Loyalists then followed after that Hunt report, basically saying the B Specials should be done away with. It also did suggest disarming the RUC, although that later didn't happen. So after this kind of clash between the British Army and Loyalists, what we see is British policy switch from appeasing nationalists to pacifying unionism, largely based on the British government's fear, which we talked about, of igniting a civil war alongside insurgency and basically just getting dragged further and further into the constitutional politics of Northern Ireland. So then from summer 1970, the British government allowed political and economic reforms in Northern Ireland to proceed at a pace that suited the Ulster Unionist Party. And at the same time, you then get the British Army using techniques of what some people might call population control to try to defeat IRA violence. And that approach then just dragged the British Army further and further into conflict with the Irish nationalist population, especially with indiscriminate security actions, a couple of them, the Falls Road curfew, internment without trial, and then Bloody Sunday, which all happened by 1972. And to such an extent that these alienate nationalists that we even see the non-violent Social Democratic and Labour Party, which are referred to as the SDLP after this, they pulled out of Stormont in the summer of 1971 in protest about a couple of things, but internment would have been one, and there was BT and Cusack killings of unarmed protesters as well during a riot in Derry. So that's partly why they pulled out, and the British government would have an investigation or tribunal into it. Anyway, so after all these things, IRA activity increased, and escalating violence eventually forced the British government to suspend Stormont in March 1972 and assume direct rule over Northern Ireland. So when the British government directly rules Northern Ireland rather than via Stormont. So by March 1972, in the words of the British Army's review of their Northern Ireland campaign, it's called Operation Banner, British aims switched to producing a quote, and this is a quote, an acceptable level of violence. Okay, and so they defined this, that meant they tried to reduce IRA activity to, and again, this is a quote from the report, a level at which normal social, political, and economic activities can take place without intimidation, end quote. Trouble was, after March 1972, right up to June, IRA activity continued, and it continued to escalate as well. So eventually what we end up with is the SDLP and William Whitelaw realized the IRA had to be included in negotiations if they actually wanted peace to emerge. And what we end up with is talks between William Whitelaw, who's Northern Ireland's Secretary of State, for the Conservative government at the time, and the IRA commenced in that period, June, July 1972, particularly the early part of July. So what we'll move on to now is the part 1B. So what's going on in the intelligence war in this period from 1969 to basically June 1972? I think essentially you've got various factors preventing British intelligence from reducing IRA activity to the anticipated acceptable level by June 1972. And what we'll do is we'll look at this on a regional basis in key IRA urban and rural northern heartlands to try and understand why that is. So the obvious place to start is in Belfast and Derry cities. So interestingly, in December 1971, in a document to the British Cabinet, Brigadier Frank Kitson believed that British forces had, quote, fined down, end quote, the Belfast IRA through arrests. So there is some evidence that intelligence had some impact on the Republican movement at this point. So in March 1972, Gerry Adams was arrested, for example. In his memoirs, Gerry Adams believes that the soldiers, and this is a quote, were obviously acting on information, end quote, since he did not permanently live at the Clonard address where he was arrested at the time. Adams was later released and denied all the charges. Then you get the period between late 1971 and June 1972 also saw something emerge called the Military Reaction Force, also known as the MRF, began operating in Belfast. So the Military Action Force, or MRF, was an undercover unit engaging in surveillance, lifting and snatching operations, and more for British forces. So basically an arm of British intelligence. Now, various books, including by Peter Taylor and Ed Maloney, discuss its activities in detail, as does someone called Simon Kersey, who's a former MRF member. And we've also got some discussion about it in UK archival papers by Brigadier Frank Kitson, interestingly. So these sources all discuss the MRF section in particular involved in what was called the Foursquare Laundry. So this discounted laundry service visited nationalist areas in Belfast, and there's a quote from Kersey's book about it. He said, quote, they collected laundry from various houses in the estate to be taken away for cleaning, but they first sent it to forensic testing, end quote. So the point is here, if the forensic testing brought back positive results, houses get raided. And we'll return to this and talk about this operation, the Foursquare Laundry, a little bit later on in the second part of the talk, and it'll become obvious the reason I've done that at that point. Eventually, the IRA rumble it, basically, by October 1972. Anyway, looking elsewhere in this period, 1969 to June 1972, we'll have a look in Derry City. That's the really major other epicenter at this point of IRA activity before June 72. What's interesting here, we got the case of what's someone who's given the code name of Observer B. They were mentioned in the Bloody Sunday inquiry, Savile inquiry, so this is how we know about this person. So Observer B was a businessman gathering information allegedly from various Loyalists and Republicans at the same time. What damage were they doing to the IRA? Well, the Savile report says they apparently set up weapon seizures against the Derry IRA in the city at times in this period. Maloney and Taylor say that the Belfast and Derry IRA's brigade, battalion, and company structure before 1975 did make it somewhat susceptible to infiltration. So just looking at this in a little bit more detail, what this means, brigade, battalion, and company structure for the IRA. So according to Danny Morrison, who's the former Sinn Féin Director of Publicity, the IRA initially, and this is a quote, fought through local people in local brigades, but that made it much easier for British intelligence services to work out who is in A, B, C company, end quote. So his point here is, in this larger structure for the IRA, and really when you got the company, so you have your brigades, below that, battalion and company, The problem is with that structure is people operating in a company are probably going to be living literally next door to each other. So if one volunteer turns as such into informer, they could reveal the identities with whom they operated with in the same area pretty easily. And it'd be quite hard to work them out because the companies had quite large numbers. And on that exact point, according to British Army statistics, this is a quote, altogether about 10,000 people were involved in the IRA between 1969 and 1972, end quote. Now, just to caveat that, some of those numbers would have been people in and out of internment as well, or prison at the time. But what's interesting with this is Tommy McConey, the former Tyrone IRA volunteer, he estimates that each unit or company at the Belfast and Derry IRA at the time had about 10 to 20 volunteers, so quite a number in one unit. So Brigadier Frank Kitson, interestingly, in writing to the British Cabinet in one report, he recognised the Belfast IRA's size made it, quote, much too big to regulate, end quote, by 1972, in his view. Despite saying these things, the intelligence war, though, I still think had very little success before June 1972. In Belfast in 1971, the IRA killed 31 of what it called its intended targets. So what it means by this is security forces in particular. That figure increases to 53 in 1972, so it's almost doubled. They also caused financial damage on Belfast City Centre. So, for example, Ian Phoenix, in his memoirs, used to be a Belfast IUC officer and later special branch officer. He notes the, quote, rest of 1971 became a blur of riots, shootings, and bombings, end quote. By June 1972, the Derry City IRA was definitely escalating its campaign as well. So by early 1972, in one report, UK officials estimated there were 2,656 shots fired at British soldiers, 225 bomb attacks on businesses within the Derry City area, costing an estimated £6 million in damages. So a Ministry of Defence assessment at the time also said in March 1972 that the, quote, commercial life of Derry City is being rapidly and visibly reduced, end quote. An Operation Banner report by the British forces believes by July 1972, quote, control was being lost to the IRA, end quote. So the question is, why? Why is this happening? So first, I think the increasing sense of alienation felt by the Irish nationalist population towards the British state, following security measures such as internment without trial, Bloody Sunday, that's key in restricting intelligence. And the problem is, without sufficient intelligence, the British Army then had to conduct continuing things like indiscriminate searches, so house searches. And even Operation Banner report accepts, this is a quote from it, these house searches probably contributed significantly to the alienation of the Catholic population, end quote. Now, furthermore, the British Army was initially blind in intelligence terms in Northern Ireland, so they relied on the IUC special branch, the police special branch. But Operation Banner states that internment failed initially because, quote, suspect lists were badly out of date, end quote. And internment, by the way, I'm sure most of you know this, but internment, August 1971, interns people without trial for suspected paramilitary activities. Primarily, it was at the start aimed against people suspected to be in the IRA. Later on, by 73, 74, there was a little bit against loyalists as well. Anyways, Operation Banner says, look, the IUC is trying to carry out internment, but the suspect list they gave us are badly out of date. The IUC's problem and why this is happening is it was pretty much no longer welcome in many working class Irish nationalist communities in Derry City or Belfast by 1969, often the places where the IRA was springing up by 1972. And then these places ended up as no-go areas, such as the Bogside in Derry, and that's going to further starve the intelligence services, whether IUC special branch or British intelligence, of any attempts to get intelligence activity and material. It's quite difficult to do that. The British Army felt the IUC special branch at first, quote, was ineffective and mistrustful of outsiders, end quote. And really, we're talking about the early 1970 period when they're saying this. Also, what's interesting in British reports, they say, look, the IUC and IUC special branch is loyal to Stormont, we're loyal to Westminster. So they think there's disagreements that are going to merge in intelligence sharing in that initial period because of those differences as well. It's important also to have a look at rural units and what are they doing for the IRA up to June, July 1972. And to prove this point, Danny Morrison believes it is a, quote, mistake to argue the IRA's war was simply being fought in Belfast or Derry, end quote. And we can see that non-Republican evidence from archives and interviewees agrees with this point. What's interesting in this period about rural units, we'll contrast this when we talk up to 72 to 75 in a little bit. However, in 1971, we see that IRA operations in Armagh, Fermanagh and Tyrone, three key rural IRA heartlands by the border, they were actually pretty infrequent at that point. And what's interesting is George Clark, a former RUC special branch officer on the border in the early 1970s, he suggests there was some infiltration in the IRA, so that might have had some impact on what was happening. Also, we know to disrupt IRA cross-border activities, British forces closed certain border roads and they set up checkpoints to try and essentially catch IRA people coming across the border. In 1972, for example, the British Army claimed they searched, quote, nearly 8,400 vehicles every single day, end quote. Nonetheless, this wasn't that effective because eventually the IRA just became aware of the permanent vehicle checkpoints in particular, and they avoided them. So an Operation Banner report by the British Army looking back on the campaign reflects actually the kind of static permanent vehicle checkpoints didn't work. UK intelligence, again, I don't think they were containing the rural IRA by June 1972. That's not why the IRA's campaign didn't really get any momentum by the time we get to the July 1972 ceasefire. I think other reasons better account for the slow momentum of the IRA initially in rural areas. So Sean McStoyfen, who is the IRA's former chief of staff at this point, believes that the IRA's defense of working class nationalist areas in Belfast, that eventually, and Derry as well, convinced many rural Republicans to join the Provisional IRA by 1972. And local connections to the cities would increase anger towards British forces, and there's a couple of examples of this. So, for example, in August 1971, for example, someone called Harry Thornton, a worker from South Armagh, was travelling through Belfast on a job. He was shot by the British Army when his van backfired. British Army claimed they thought it was an attack. According to Toby Harnden in his book about South Armagh, there's a riot occurs in Crossmaglen after Thornton's funeral that day. But the main catalyst for increased IRA activity in rural areas was actually historical and contemporary events, basically a mix between the two. So Danny Morrison, for example, suggested the South Armagh IRA, we need to remember, had already conducted a car bomb in August 1970, which killed 2 RUC officers, and that's before the Harry Thornton incident we've just talked about. And the point here is that there was partly a historical hatred of the British state for some Irish nationalists in counties Armagh, Fermanagh and Tyrone due to partition, especially as we need to remember that some of these areas have majority nationalist populations, even at the time of partition. Tommy McConey agrees that nationalists in County Tyrone, and this is a quote from him, had a long tradition of electing IRA personnel from Crumlin Road Jail to Westminster even in the 1950s, end quote, and that's during the IRA's border campaign in that period. But there's also short-term factors are at work as well here, and that is kind of increasing the Republican attempts to recruit people. So John White in his article explains how political and social economic discrimination was more prominent west of the River Bann in Northern Ireland to enable a unionist minority there to control local politics. So where unionists were a minority, these bases then of discrimination would often be worse to try and ensure they could still control local resources or the council. Specific British Army actions obviously also provoked hostility with some rural nationalists. So Operation Banner report admits closing cross-border roads was, quote, generally unpopular with the local nationalist population, many of whom had legitimate farming or other business interests and family links on both sides of the border, end quote. In Strabane, the British Army noticed an increase in IRA activity by March 1972 in their reports. British forces had actually caused controversy there, which might explain why this happened. So in August 1971, they shot 28-year-old unarmed Amy McDavitt, who was also deaf, during a riot there. This caused so much controversy that the Irish government actually later used the McDavitt killing case against the British government during a European Court of Human Rights case they brought against them. Sean McStoyfen writes that the McDavitt killing provided an upsurge in Republican support as well. And the early 1970s in rural areas, again, is going to see opposition to internment in rural localities as well. So part 1C, why was there a ceasefire then, and why did it fail between June and July 1972? So primarily, I definitely think it's the IRA's escalating campaign and there being no political alternatives at this point meant that the UK state had to hold ceasefire talks with the IRA in June, July 1972. And despite lacking a political mandate at this point, the IRA's escalating campaign shows it had a significant minority of nationalist support alongside armed strength and a political plan via Éire Nua for a federal island, and also had no-go areas. Other key point with this is the SDLP, who realised the IRA's strengths at this point, further convinced the British government then that it basically had no choice but to talk to the IRA. So to be honest, in most of the academic work on this period and journalistic work as well, there's not much disagreement about why the British government talks to the IRA. They're the general factors that most people agree with. Where there is a disagreement is about why did those talks fail in June, July 1972 to create a peace settlement. So giving you a couple of examples of this, Peter Taylor, John Bew and others, they claim that the London ceasefire talks with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, William Whitelaw, where he invited the IRA leaders and Republican leaders to come across for talks. Those authors say that failed because the IRA made absurd demands for an immediate United Ireland. That's their view. However, Jonathan Powell, who's Tony Blair's former advisor in Northern Ireland, Tony Craig's work, Neil O'Doherty's work, and myself disagree with that interpretation. And I actually think when we look at it, the ceasefire broke down for multiple reasons. First reason, the British government offered absolutely no political way forward for Republicans. So we need to remember in this period that Sinn Féin was actually banned until May 1974 in the North. Second, Neil O'Doherty says that letting the other side know your bottom line in negotiations immediately when talks begin is pretty unwise. The reason why is you lose your bargaining power. So the point with this is, yet the British government still misjudged that the IRA would turn up for the talks in London, June, July 1972, despite its escalating campaign, and would just make compromises immediately. So what we're saying is that's totally unrealistic. It's also inaccurate to suggest that the IRA wanted the ceasefire to collapse. The evidence doesn't suggest that's the case. So the newly formed Loyalist Ulster Defence Association, the UDA at this point, rejected nationalist refugees moving into the Lenadoon housing estate, which was close to a Loyalist area around Belfast. So since the IRA had partly come into existence, we need to remember to defend Republicans, they had to respond to Loyalist threats. They wouldn't be able to just sit there and allow that to happen at this point. So even William Whitelaw, Northern Ireland Secretary of State, he publicly berated the IRA and said they were the reason the ceasefire broke down. In private, in cabinet papers, he says it was the UDA. And he said they're principally to blame for the ceasefire ending because they created that situation in the Lenadoon housing estate. So increasing IRA violence and barricades in Belfast and Derry also suggests Republicans had a pretty sizable support in working class areas. If that was translated into votes at that point, it may have been pretty difficult for the British government to reject concessions to Republicans. So the point with this is, by not pushing for Sinn Féin's legalisation in those talks, the IRA was being susceptible to being ignored. So there's a bit of a missed opportunity there as well. Okay, so that takes us, that's the 1969 to 1972 July period. What we're going to look at next is the period after this. So basically August 1972, and then we'll go up right to December 1975. So we'll start by looking at UK and IRA strategies against each other in this period. And it gets particularly interesting in this period when the Labour government's in power, which I'll talk about in a minute, for some of the new kind of measures they were trying to bring in to solve the conflict. So there's split opinions on why the IRA called and then broke its second prolonged ceasefire, which is in 1975. There's a few examples of this, again, I'll give you from the different readings. So Stuart Aveyard and Ed Maloney suggest that significant infiltration of the Belfast IRA largely forced the IRA into its second ceasefire, prolonged ceasefire in 1975. And they then believe that the British government lied about withdrawal and mentioned withdrawal by MI6 back channel contacts, the IRA at this point, lied about it to trick the IRA into a power-sapping ceasefire, which the IRA eventually realised and went back to its campaign. So that's their view. Then you get Martin Frampton, John Bew and others. They argue that a combination of British intelligence successes against the Belfast IRA, with Harold Wilson at the same time, who was the UK Prime Minister in 1975, wanting British political disengagement from Northern Ireland, led to the ceasefire in 1975. But Frampton and Bew suggest UK policy was not driven by Harold Wilson. So really the ceasefire, from the other perspective of other UK practitioners and policymakers at that point, was about stringing the IRA along, again, 1975. Slight difference in opinion. So Peter Taylor and Neumann suggest that the UK government wanted a political solution involving the IRA in 1975, which kept the North within the UK to observe Unionist majority consent wishes. So they actually think they did want to include Republicans in the settlement, but they believe that once the IRA realised it couldn't get Irish unity in the ceasefire talks, the ceasefire just became about stringing them along instead. So I disagree with these interpretations, and I agree with authors including Neil O'Doherty. And the point they say is, outside of Belfast, or on my particular view with intelligence conflict, outside of Belfast in this period, 1972 to 1975, the elusive and secretive nature of IRA units in Derry City, South Armagh, Tyrone, and the IRA's campaign in England made them pretty difficult to infiltrate and pretty difficult to restrain by 1975. The other thing we'll talk about in this section is the Belfast IRA's restructuring before 1975 saw its campaign switch to a more sustainable long-term trajectory of persistence rather than trying to escalate its campaign. So the IRA called a ceasefire in 1975. I'll explain in this section, primarily because leading figures within the British government and British government personnel sought to politically withdraw from Northern Ireland via some form of withdrawal, which would probably take the form of independence or dominion status, as somewhere like Australia has within the UK Commonwealth. And that was being communicated, as I'll explain, to the IRA via MI6 and Northern Ireland Office back-channel talks throughout 1975. Why did the ceasefire end? And I'll explain, I think that largely happened because the IRA and Loyalist grassroots, mainly UDA, refused to engage in elections and in institutions the UK government tried to create basically around them. So UK and IRA strategy, we'll do part 2A in a bit more detail now, 1972 to 1975. Simple enough before May 1974. So from August 1972 to May 1974, British political policy under the Conservative government focused on creating a political settlement between the SDLP and Unionists. And generally, I think the Labour government from February 1974 up to May 1974, when the power sharing agreement, initial one, Sunningdale, as it was called, because it was signed in the Civil Service Staff College in England, so that's why it's called Sunningdale. Until that collapsed, August 1972 to May 1974, that was the British government's policy. Create a political settlement between the SDLP and Unionists. British security policy then, in the meantime, attempted to reduce the IRA's campaign back to that kind of acceptable nuisance level between August 1972 and basically May 1974. Simple as that. There was no intention to include Republicans in talks at all in that period and in ceasefire efforts. The more interesting period in this sense is, in contrast, the evidence does suggest to me that leading British civil servants and, crucially, leading British government members from the Labour Party at this point envisaged Loyalists and Republicans trying to agree an independent Northern Ireland after May 1974's failed power sharing experiment. So other authors, including people like Michael Kerr in his book, have suggested Wilson and lone members of the British government contemplated withdrawal privately in the Labour administration. But to me, evidence suggests eventual independence for Northern Ireland became the British Labour government's policy privately between May 1974 and December 1975. When I say privately, they communicated this to Republicans, Loyalists, the SDLP, the Irish government, etc., in back-channel talks or talks held in private overall. So let's have a look at some evidence for this. So the legalisation of Sinn Féin and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF temporarily, in May 1974, marked the beginning of attempts to politicise them. The UVF was then proscribed again by 1975. Sinn Féin obviously stayed legal for the rest of the conflict. So my argument is also supported by evidence from British state archival papers, Merlin Rees's diaries. Merlin Rees was the Northern Ireland Secretary of State for Labour government in this period between February 1974 into, I believe he stood down sometime in 1976, so just after this period. I can't remember exactly when. It was in the end of the winter period, March possibly, in 1976. So his diaries are important to back this argument up. Garrett Fitzgerald's papers, who was the Irish Foreign Minister at this point, Rory O'Broader's papers, used to be one of the leading Republicans at this point, and the diaries of Brendan Duddy. So we'll talk about some of these sources. Brendan Duddy was the main Republican intermediary with the British government and, in a sense, MI6 in 1975. So it's true that, yeah, there were elements within the UK state that were unhappy with ideas trying to get Republicans and Loyalists to explore any withdrawal options from Northern Ireland. But the point is, those directing policy who supported this kind of thing, such as Secretary of State Merlin Rees, Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and, for example, Sir Frank Cooper, who was the permanent secretary at the Northern Ireland office, they met with actual little resistance. They're the people who control policy. That's why the policy started to follow this direction in private. So let's have a look at a little bit of evidence for it. So on the 20th of May 1975, the diary of Bernard Donoghue, who was a senior policy advisor to Harold Wilson, records Wilson being, and this is a quote, in favour of some sort of dominion status for Northern Ireland, end quote. And it's that diary in particular says that Wilson supported that settlement idea right up to autumn 1975. Donoghue also says that Frank Cooper, as we said, the permanent undersecretary at the Northern Ireland office, supported independence in a meeting between cabinet members in October 1975. He thought that was the best solution. More importantly, and also interestingly, in March 1975, Merlin Rees noted in his own diaries, again, these were private, this is a quote, he said, "What we need is time over a period of X years, and the more that unfolds, what we will get is something like an independent Northern Ireland with links to the south of Ireland, end quote. What's interesting is when we contextualize this and what Rees was saying to the cabinet, I think it seems to make sense of what the Labour government's attempting to do in this period. So Rees told the Northern Ireland Ministerial Committee in February 1975 this, and this is a quote. He said, the Provisional IRA will no doubt try to bring us quickly to discuss a declaration of British intention to withdraw, but we must make them realise that is totally irrelevant. It is their Protestant fellow Irishmen with whom they must come to terms. But if the Provisionals are looking for a face-saving formula, I do not rule out the possibility that we could find a form of words which would not inflame the Loyalists, end quote. So what's he talking about here? I think this idea, this face-saving formula about withdrawal that would not inflame Loyalists, as he said, seems to imply some kind of Northern Irish Dominion status or independence. Either it remain in the Commonwealth or it just be an independent state. So Merlin Rees knew, as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that that was a possible political solution. And he knew that because British intermediaries under his direction had met leading UDA, Ulster Defence Association members in June 1974, who told British intermediaries they were considering independence for Northern Ireland as a possible political solution. And just to show that British officials were not being led up the garden path and the UDA weren't saying one thing to them and doing something different in practice, we also know that Irish officials in private contacts with some unionist politicians and the UDA, so both unionist politicians and the UDA, also found that they favoured independence in 1975, especially as they feared UK unilateral withdrawal. Hence, this seems to explain why British MI6 and Northern Ireland Office officials tried to get Irish Republicans to make deals with Loyalists. They kept going on about this in the back channel talks. So give an example. In May 1975, for example, British intermediaries told Republican leaders, this is a quote, the Loyalists are not rigid regarding the British connection and there is an opportunity here for Republicans, end quote. Irish state representatives in 1975 also privately reflected that some Republicans might accept independence for Northern Ireland because agreed it, quote, meant breaking the connection with England, end quote. When Brennan Duddy, the Republicans' intermediary with MI6, told UK officials, MI6, Northern Ireland Office, IRA leaders would consider an independent Northern Ireland under Loyalist rule in the short term, that then sparked intense interest on the British side right up to the Prime Minister. So it didn't just go to kind of bottom level officials, it went straight up to the Prime Minister and Northern Ireland Office when Brennan Duddy said that in back channel meeting in October 1975. What we then see is in a private telegram, Merlin Rees, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, told Harold Wilson, Prime Minister, in November 1975, this, and this is a quote. He said, Contact, who's Brennan Duddy, said that they would contemplate a future Loyalist government in a 6-county Ulster. They wanted first from us a private declaration of intent to withdraw. We replied to them expressing interest combined with readiness to talk, but not to give a declaration of intent to withdraw, end quote. So again, let's put this, what does this mean? What exactly are they saying here? So Wilson and Rees could accept a 6-county independent Northern Ireland agreed with Unionists and or Loyalists with Republicans. They had no problem with that. What they couldn't give, in their view, was the private or public declaration of intent to withdraw by the British government because they preferred it would provoke a, quote, massive confrontation with a Protestant population, end quote. As IRA activities then continued, and with the Provisional IRA wanting at least a private declaration of intent to withdraw by the British government, because basically didn't believe them that they were going to go, British interest in further conversations decreased. And what we see is direct rule was gradually accepted as the way forward after November 1975. Why did the Labour government consider withdrawal? As the last point with this section 2A. The Labour government had not become pro-Republican. I don't think that's what was going on here. Instead, I think a fear of a two-front war post-Sunningdale, there was a genuine fear that Unionists were going to try the British government to push the British government out. Also, there was a need to appease UK mainland public opinion who favoured withdrawal, and a need to, this is a quote from our cabinet meeting, insulate Great Britain from the ills which afflicted the province, end quote, including pub bombings, as one ministerial committee member noted in late 1974. All of those things motivate the UK government under Labour to try and search for a solution that distanced Northern Ireland from the UK mainland. So and the key thing with this, I'm not saying this was, just necessarily done in the shadows, is done with bad intention. I generally think this is a genuine attempt at solution by the Labour government at this point to an unending conflict. okay, it's a little bit for selfish motives to try and basically get Northern Ireland affairs out of UK mainland affairs, but they were trying to create a very wide settlement. And when I say wide, that included paramilitary groups, to trying to make it much more inclusive of everyone. And really, we don't really see that again to the 1990s. So it's quite far-fetched an attempt what they're trying to do at this point. Having said all these things, a constant feature of British military and intelligence policy between July 1972 and December 1975 was reaching a, quote, acceptable level of IRA activity, end quote. Under the Conservatives, the British government and Edward Heath sought to damage the IRA's armed capacity to such an extent that it could not disrupt a new power-sharing executive with Sunningdale. Under Harold Wilson's Labour government from May 1974, a reduction in IRA activities was the prerequisite to getting Republicans to accept a political compromise. So, Section 2B, intelligence war against the IRA, July 1972 to December 1975. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on in intelligence conflict and see how that's linking into the ceasefire that's eventually declared in 1975 and whether that's the reason the ceasefire emerges. Essentially, I don't think it is. And overall, the IRA was not forced into peace talks by the 1975 ceasefire. We'll start by having a look at the Belfast IRA in this period. So we get accounts, including by Jerry Bradley, who's a former IRA member, and Ed Maloney, suggest that the IRA was under significant pressure in Belfast following infiltration by 1975. There's a couple of examples of this that partly back up their argument. So in 1973, leading Belfast Republicans, including people like Brennan Hughes, were arrested. And according to the British Army at this point, this is a quote, at one stage, the active tour of duty of a provisional IRA officer from appointment to arrest was about 4 weeks by the time you get to 1975. Okay, it's the end of that quote, and they're talking specifically about Belfast there for that quote. So a further sign of infiltration in Belfast came in October 1972. The IRA then attacked the Four Square laundry service. So I said we'd return to this, so let's have a chat about this episode now. Peter Taylor, Ed Maloney, and others say that informers exposed that laundry service. That's eventually why it was caught out. Senior IRA commanders then struck back against it on the 2nd of October 1972. They killed the van driver. There is various other things connected to this, like a massage parlor, and the IRA basically went against that as well. But there's debates about whether anyone was killed in these situations, etc. But that's about the Four Square laundry and how it eventually collapsed. Jerry Bradley, David McKittrick and others, and Ed Maloney have also discussed the case of Eamon Malloy's alleged informing. So Malloy was allegedly an IRA volunteer from North Belfast, according to these accounts. Sometime in 1972, he was supposedly arrested and supposedly began informing. So Ed Maloney in his book suggests that Malloy damaged the IRA, and this is a quote from his book, on such a scale that his activities played a major role in forcing the IRA to call a ceasefire, end quote, and he's talking about in 1975. Eamon Malloy was then disappeared, and his body was only returned in 1999 as part of the finding that disappeared. Key point to say with these things, we cannot verify if he actually was informing, and the families in many of these cases frequently deny it, so it's quite key to say. If we have a look at what the IRA is doing in its general activity, so Belfast IRA killing statistics also fell from 58 intended targets in 1972, quite dramatically to 12 in Belfast in 1974. So there's a clear decline on what's happening from there. One Belfast Republican says the trouble was, quote, the structures of the early 1970s meant that everybody knew everything about everybody else, end quote. And his point is, one agent or informer in the larger company, brigade and battalion units could gather considerable information on their counterparts. And the problem is they're very difficult to locate for the IRA, these informers, in terms of trying to find out who's passed the information, because the units are so large, it's very, very difficult to find out who's doing that. And also, you know, intelligence security force people said what essentially happened is they'd often arrest a bunch of people, say like 20, and then they'd release 15, and they'd keep 15 in, release 5, one of them's the informer. So again, you can't actually work out that easily who's in passing information. Operation Banner reports also says, quote, detaining individuals for a few hours in this period to allow what they called screening was useful, since some individuals were quite happy to pass information in privacy, end quote. Danny Morrison agrees with this. He said, quote, dozens of people were screened at the time, and it became very hard for the IRA to work out who were informers, end quote. Nevertheless, so there is intelligence impact on the Belfast IRA up to 1975. That can't be denied. But other factors, again, are leading to a decline for the Belfast IRA as well. So Jerry Bradley explains, quote, shootings were seriously restricted after Operation Motorman, end quote, because the British Army moved into permanent checkpoints. Operation Motorman happens in August 1972, and it's the period where the British Army gets rid of barricades in parts of West Belfast and mainly in the Bogside area, Derry City, to basically kind of reclaim those areas for carrying out patrols. Bradley, Kersey, and others also say that the Belfast IRA began restructuring into cells from about late 1973, so sometimes earlier than often is suspected. So what was the cell structure? So typically this was changing IRA units in Belfast and Derry to consist of 4 to 10 volunteers maximum, mixed from different areas of Belfast. So cells potentially made finding informers a little bit easier because the units were going to be smaller. So the restructuring partly explains the Belfast IRA's reduction in its activities. So we know, as we talked about earlier, the IRA killed 12 intended targets in Belfast in 1974. When Belfast formally disbanded battalions and companies after 1975, the IRA then never killed more than 18 of what it called its intended targets per year. That's because it began focusing on a lower but more sustainable campaign in Belfast. However, saying all these things, British intelligence efforts did encourage a restructuring in Belfast that can't be denied in this period. If we turn to Derry City, so in January 1975, Frank Cooper speculated, quote, that the Provisional IRA sought a truce because they were battered in Belfast and at a standstill in Londonderry, end quote. So some leading Derry Republicans, including Sean Keenan and Martin McGuinness, were arrested in late 1972, Keenan by British forces, McGuinness by the Gardaí. IRA killings there also declined in Derry City by 1975. We know that Derry City units have killed some alleged informers by 1975, but again, there's not enough evidence available to validate whether those people actually were informing or not. So Shane Paul O'Doherty, who was a former Derry City volunteer, he says that one problem again by August 1972 for the Derry IRA was, quote, the British Army was in effective control, end quote, again, following Operation Motorman and the removal of barricades. Nonetheless, the Derry City IRA from the evidence was not a standstill by 1975. That seems inaccurate. So Peter Taylor, for example, records by the early 1970s, we only have 20 out of 150 shops in Derry City Centre still trading after the IRA's bombing campaign. Alan Barker, who's a former RUC Special Branch and RUC member who operated in Derry City, he explains bombings and shootings continued there even after Operation Motorman with fair regularity. And Shane Paul O'Doherty says prior to 1975 ceasefire, and this is a quote, we were running rings around the British Army and the RUC, end quote. So IRA killings of intended targets, yes, that declined in Derry in this period, but commercial bombings in the sniper campaign continued. So the point I'm making here is that death statistics failed to provide an accurate assessment of the Derry City IRA's strengths by 1975. Now, Neil O'Doherty and Republicans and security force members believe the IRA was retaining support in Derry City following Bloody Sunday and other indiscriminate security operations. What's interesting as well, the British Army personnel and Shane Paul O'Doherty also say the IRA began to create a smaller, tighter organisation in Derry City after Operation Motorman. So only 5 or 6 on-the-run members operated in each area of Derry City for the IRA, basically operating in cell units. With fewer members, that meant the IRA is going to be much harder to apprehend. And the thing is as well, even if they're actually caught, volunteers were very unlikely to yield vital intelligence because the leaders of the Derry City IRA were often hiding out at Donegal in this period across the border. Again, yes, the Gardaí did arrest some IRA leaders in this period from Derry, but the border was much too vast to comprehensively police for the Gardaí, who lacked resources, finance, etc., to be able to do that. So Shane Paul O'Doherty suggests the Derry City Brigade considered a ceasefire by 1975 because some volunteers wanted, quote, political progress and a realistic deal, and living on the run was acceptable only for a limited period of time, end quote. So next we'll talk about the rural IRA units in this period, certainly gained momentum by 1975, despite killing a few alleged informers. So IRA bombing and shooting statistics increased in Tyrone and South Armagh by 1975. These are the two standout areas for the IRA's rural campaign in this period. And a former British soldier believes before 1975, and this is a quote, they said, I don't think we were getting substantial penetration of the IRA in the rural areas, and I don't think we were physically defeating the IRA in rural areas either by 1975, end quote. And we can basically cross-reference this with a cabinet report. So in November 1975, Merlin Rees and Frank Cooper told Irish counterparts in the London embassy, the Irish London embassy that there was, quote, virtual anarchy in South Armagh, end quote. And Kieran Conway, a former Republican member, agrees by 1975, quote, the IRA was stronger in many rural areas than ever, end quote. So the Tyrone and South Armagh IRA did not kill the numbers that the Belfast Brigade was able to manage in its intended targets by 1972. But the point is here, that's never actually going to be expected. The rural units had a much smaller population from which to recruit, so rural IRA units had much less capacity for escalating violence to the Belfast levels. The threat that rural IRA units posed was the ability to inflict numerous casualties in single attacks, as various examples discussed in my book talk about. After Bloody Friday, the IRA in the city scaled down car bomb usage in, as I said, in the cities Belfast and Derry, as constant civilian casualties produced negative publicity. That continues into the 80s, particularly when Sinn Féin stands candidates in elections. The key thing is for rural areas, they didn't have that problem because they had much ease of space where they could carry out much larger attacks without the risk of killing civilians regularly. So from the mid-1970s, a former British soldier recognized this, and this is a quote from them. They said, if it's going right for the IRA in Belfast, we knew that one person would die. But if it's going right for the IRA in rural areas, we knew a lot of people would die. In Belfast, they generally had smaller bombs, whereas in the rural areas, the IRA had much larger bombs, end quote. So IRA landmine attacks on country roads in South Armagh actually led to the security forces abandoning motorized vehicle patrols in the 1970s, for example. An interesting caveat to this is the Fermanagh IRA's campaign, which was much less intense by 1975. There's not actually known cases of informers that we know about for that area. Of course, I accept that some of them might remain undetected, so we don't necessarily know this. But according to British security analysis, two particular factors influenced that fluctuation in the IRA's activity in Fermanagh. So first, the presence of a large Protestant security force community there in Fermanagh made the IRA a little bit more cautious about operating at times, thinking it was much harder to do so from local surveillance. The second factor is Fermanagh is an example of where there's a lack of organisers for the IRA at certain times. And in smaller rural units, you needed organisers to get the campaign ignited and momentum growing. So a few factors specific to the early 1970s made infiltrating the rural IRA very tricky. So Tommy McKerney, former Tyrone volunteer, suggests, quote, with wider spaces and different terrain, the smaller rural IRA units prove much more difficult to pin down, end quote. He also points out that many rural IRA units could cross into the Republic and were shielded by, quote, hardcore support concentrated along the border, end quote. McKerney also says rural active service units for the IRA were, quote, self-contained semi-autonomous groups, end quote, based on friends and family, only meeting senior IRA leaders for training, supplies, or to discuss, quote, broad policy objectives, quote. Hence, rural units were generally resistant to infiltration by outsiders by the time we get to 1975. Outsiders from urban areas were much less common and much less likely to be taken on by rural units by the mid-1970s. So Lawrence McKeown, a former Republican prisoner, he explained, this is a quote, somebody coming down from Belfast would have to get used to operating in the country, and that was very different, end quote. Kieran Conway, originally from Dublin, shows this point in practice. So he preferred urban operations because, quote, it was physically less demanding than operating on the border and marches through difficult terrain, often with heavy equipment such as landmines, end quote. So these factors meant the South Armagh and Tyrone IRA became very difficult to infiltrate. And the increase in IRA activities across Northern Ireland made the Republican movement a much greater threat, I argue, by 1975, because it was no longer just this kind of urban phenomenon that could be extinguished in Belfast and Derry City. And being so difficult to capture and infiltrate made rural units much more durable in the long term for the IRA's campaign as well. So according to William Matchett, a former RUC special branch officer, this is a quote, by the mid-1970s, cross-border IRA units had replaced Belfast IRA as the greatest threat, end quote. Alienation caused partly, as we talked about, by state security measures in Tyrone and South Armagh provided a bedrock of long-term IRA support. Just to turn now to have a look at the IRA's campaign in England. So Operation Banner Report believes the IRA, quote, learned that one bomb in London had more impact than 10 bombs in Northern Ireland, end quote. The IRA's initial attack in England led to arrests. So in March 1973, the IRA injured 200 people after car bombs in London, including outside the Old Bailey. Numerous Republicans were arrested when attempting to fly back to Ireland. What's interesting is in 2009, Clark's account of being in the IUC special branch in this period alleged that a senior Republican actually had informed on that attack, and that's why there was arrest after it was carried out. The IRA then did carry out various measures to try and stop similar mistakes in the future. So they started to reduce the numbers who knew about English operations. So Tommy McKerney says, quote, "It would generally be 1 or 2 people on the IRA's general headquarters staff who would know," end quote, "and the chief of staff of the IRA guiding IRA operations, and also those people handpicked to operate in England." Just as a little background piece, the chief of staff of the IRA was appointed by the IRA's 7-person Army Council, and that directed day-to-day IRA activities. Phelim O'Hamel, a former Republican prisoner, also recalls the IRA's England department selected members from, quote, "all over Ireland," end quote. And Lawrence McKeown says that volunteers in England, quote, "were told to stay out of Irish pubs and clubs because that would just attract attention," end quote. They also remained undercover and didn't try to escape post-attacks to prevent arrests. So overall, changes introduced seemed to work by 1975. So the security services seemed at a complete loss to try and counter many IRA operations in England. And in February 1974, for example, an IRA bomb exploded on a coach on the M62, killing 9 soldiers and 3 civilians. The lack of intelligence is pretty evident when Judith Ward was wrongly convicted for that attack. In the autumn of 1974, a series of indiscriminate pub bombings included 2 public houses bombed in Birmingham. 21 people died. The police arrested and convicted 6 Irish people, but again, they were released in 1991 on appeal, showing the lack of intelligence. In June 1974, an IRA device in the Houses of Parliament injured 11 people as well. Alan Barker, the former IUC Special Branch member, he argues that IRA bombings in England in this period, quote, "placed heavy pressure on the British government to commence peace talks," end quote. Nonetheless, Rory O'Broader also says the IRA cessation in 1975 helped counter negative fallout for the Republican movement from the pub bombings. So the overall point of Section 2B is that by 1975, the IRA had spread and posed a much more kind of persistent threat in the longer term. And as Merlin Rees told the British cabinet and his colleagues in February 1974, he said, quote, "the IRA are not beaten," end quote. Sorry, that was February 1975. So he said the IRA were not beaten at that point. So that brings us to final section, Section 2C. Why did the IRA call and then break a ceasefire in 1975? So we partly talked about this and we talked about British government policy, but I believe from the evidence that the IRA leadership called a ceasefire in 1975, or ceasefires because it broke temporarily and then it was renewed, primarily because the British government said in back-channel contacts it was willing to withdraw in some form to Republicans. Now, Neil O'Doherty in his book is right to say that Republican leaders, quote, "were willing to make major compromises," end quote, in this period, as they recognized there was a stalemate situation. So the IRA initially wanted Eire-Nua, a 4-province federal system of the United Ireland. But in October 1975, their back-channel contact with the MI6 representatives to the British state, Brennan Duddy, he claimed that Irish Republican leaders would accept temporarily a 6-county setup under Loyalist rule with human rights and minority rights guarantees, but this is a quote from him, but that would require a steady transition to a 32-county socialist republic. He said the Republican movement had but one aim, eventual withdrawal of the British. Everything is compromisable after British declaration of intent to withdraw, end quote. So in other words, Duddy felt that Republicans would accept independence because British sovereignty would cease. Now, there could be a question asked here, which is, was Brendan Duddy exaggerating how far Republican leaders would go in talks? Well, elsewhere, Brendan Duddy claims that Rory O'Broader told him in November 1975, this is a quote, "We had offered the British everything, to live in a Protestant Northern Ireland under Loyalist control if only the British would leave," end quote. Duddy then claims Billy McKee, veteran Belfast Republican leader in this point, remarked in May 1976 he would settle, quote, "for an independent Ulster," end quote. More interestingly, in some respects, because it's not from a Republican source, in October 1975, Bill Craig, who was the Unionist Vanguard Party leader, so a kind of hardline Unionist party at this point, he told Irish government officials in private, quote, "We Unionists have been getting a series of messages from the Provisional IRA that they would agree to independence on certain conditions," end quote. That's interesting because it squares with what Duddy was telling British MI6 members in private talks that went back to Harold Wilson. So it seems to be that this seems to be accurate about what Republican leaders were considering. But the caveat to all of this is the precondition to any compromise remained a public or private declaration of British intent to withdraw from Northern Ireland. Because the Republican movement was not facing terminal decline by 1975, and they believed the British government were considering withdrawal. So they saw absolutely no reason to accept British sovereignty remaining in any form. And one of the key points for this as well is they did not believe that Unionists and Loyalists would ever compromise unless the British government left in some form. And we can see this, for example, when Merlin Rees realised in November 1975, whilst Irish Republican leaders might compromise with Loyalists, quote, they wanted first from us a private declaration of intent to withdraw from Ireland, end quote. And as we talked about earlier, Merlin Rees and Harold Wilson refused to do that because they feared there'd be a Loyalist uprising. So the point is, the ceasefire in 1975 was only observed whilst the IRA leadership felt British withdrawal was on the table. But there's another question here, is were Republicans deluded about British withdrawal? Well, the key point is the British certainly mentioned it at various times in private during the ceasefire period. One example, Brendan Duddy and Rory O'Broader both claim in December 1974, the British said they wanted to, quote, discuss structures of disengagement, end quote. The other really interesting thing here is the SDLP, the Irish government, also Unionists from the DUP and the UUP and Vanguard, and Loyalists, particularly from the UDA, also record British ministers mentioning withdrawal to them, and that included in the form of an independent Northern Ireland. In fact, the Irish government was so concerned that the British government might be hinting at a unilateral declaration of intention to withdraw that the Irish government then contacted the United Nations, the UN, to explore options for a peacekeeping force in summer 1974. That's how worried they were about what the British government was up to. But the British government would not declare privately or publicly withdrawal, again, because it feared provoking a civil war. The British government wanted Republicans to try and realise anything could happen if Republicans agreed a settlement with Loyalists first. Essentially, in my view, from the British government, they just wanted it detached and out of the way. But what they did not want was a civil war, which would mean more intervention by the British government. As Neil O'Doherty argues, Republicans overlooked the, quote, countervailing pressures from Loyalists, Unionists, and the security forces and the Irish government and the SDLP in this period. So the point is, the British government could not prioritise Republican demands. And also, without an electoral mandate across Ireland or an IRA victory, there was very little leverage the IRA could get towards British withdrawal. And after 1975, Republican leaders realised the importance of an electoral mandate. So that just brings us to the conclusion. So from late November 1975, the British government and the British state prepared for what they called a long war, end quote, to try to reduce IRA violence to an acceptable level. Nevertheless, a British civil servant warned his cabinet colleagues in May 1976 this in a document to the cabinet. This is a quote. He said that republicanism will not go away. It's consistently enjoyed a good deal of political, if not electoral support. Until we involve the Republican tradition in political life, the execution of a long-term coherent strategy will not work and it will fail, end quote. Now, as Neil O'Doherty says in his work, this was a losing paper. The British government ignored it. But my book argues by the time we get to 1998, this civil servant was right and basically somewhat prophetic. Even informers within the IRA's hierarchy did not make Republicans politically or militarily irrelevant by the 1990s. So in a way, we kind of go around in circles and we end up with British government talking to the IRA again by the 1990s and late 80s as well. So I've explained various regional factors that were preventing the intelligence war from forcing the IRA into a trajectory of decline by 1975. And instead, the 1972 and 1975 ceasefires emerged primarily because UK ministers were willing to consider political avenues forward, and that included some version of British withdrawal in 1975. So the last question is, were the two ceasefires missed opportunities for peace? And I think here, Powell and Neil O'Doherty are right. Yes. During the 1972 ceasefire, the UK government provided no political option for the IRA, and the IRA didn't demand one. In the 1975 ceasefire, IRA and Loyalist unwillingness, somewhat understandably because they didn't trust the British government, to politicise made it too difficult for the British government to justify the inclusion of peace and to justify any settlement such as independence led by Republicans and Loyalists. In contrast, what we see by the 1990s is Sinn Féin's sizable minority of the Northern nationalist political mandate that was key in helping to convince all sides to make concessions and peace. Thanks very much for listening, and happy to take questions as well. I will stop sharing the screen at this point.
That's great. Thanks so much, Thomas. I have a couple of questions coming through. I've one there from Francis. So Francis's question is, the independent Ulster option that the British government may have favoured in the early 70s, what was the main cause of the shift towards a long-term direct rule conflict, and how did Loyalists feel at that time about independence? Weren't some interested in that?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for the question as well. So first of all, the shift in terms of, why did the British government move away? I think I'm right with what you're asking here. Why did the British government move away from this towards back to direct rule? So I think the key thing from looking at this, and I've been doing a little bit of work with Neil O'Doherty on this recently, actually, so it's quite fresh in the mind, is from the British government perspective, as I said, it's not because they'd suddenly, there's a lot of things in historical books about Harold Wilson was a crypto Irish Republican, etc. That's not really what's happening here. What's happening here is that the number one priority of the Westminster government, I don't really think this has massively changed today, is Westminster politics and where they generally get their votes from. So really, we're talking about constituencies mainly in England, because that's where the majority of the UK vote is going to come from. So when we put that in perspective in 1974, the Labour government was looking at it thinking, wow, we've just had Sunningdale and basically unionists revolting against Westminster in terms of bringing down power sharing there. Then they had the situation where the IRA, particularly the attacks in England, the pub bombings. And there was a couple of instances, which I talk about in the book, where there was a couple of factories in Birmingham had to be shut temporarily after the IRA pub bombings there, because there was fights basically between second, third generation Irish people who work in factories and English people targeting them, basically blaming them for attacks. To put you in perspective, like the Labour government at that point, they really didn't like this because they were getting a lot of vote from working class Irish immigrants into England. So for the Labour government, this was an absolute nightmare. So they just thought, look, by this point, unionists, the only thing they felt was unionists don't want us here, and nor do Republicans either. So we'll go. And then they can make their own minds up about what to happen. Why did they change away from this perspective? So I think they tried to go to independence because it suited Westminster priorities. Why did they move away from it? Kind of the same thing, which is basically they realized then as it went on with the ceasefire that yes, and that links to your second part of your question, unionists and some unionist politicians in private, plus particularly the UDA, were willing to consider this, but they weren't too keen on the whole politicization thing. And Republican leaders wanted politicization, but the grassroots generally didn't, again, because they feared it would dilute the armed campaign, but also they were worried that this was a whole trick by the British government, and that once they signed up to something like this, the British government then would literally just stay and then prop up some kind of unionist regime. So basically, they ended up pulling back because they realized it would take too much effort. And I think if we contrast, say, the government with Harold Wilson in 1975 with Tony Blair's government in 1997, you think of the, I mean, whatever people think of Tony Blair's up to yourselves. But the point I'm making is that the amount of effort the Labour government put in, say, between 1997 and 2006-7 to get power sharing up and running, it took a lot of effort, but they had a massive majority, so they could concentrate time on Northern Ireland. Harold Wilson had a 4-seat majority. So this was a risky thing to do. And he just thought, essentially, the British government would open the chest of options, and then, yeah, Republicans and Loyalists would take it on. But they didn't do that. So the British government thought, okay, we'll go back to direct rule. That seems the easier thing to do. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, good question.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. I've one here from Liam. Did the Irish government collect and pass on much intelligence about the IRA to the British government? And was there much cooperation between the two governments? And the second part to his question then, was this more prominent when Fine Gael came to power in 733 rather than under Fianna Fáil in the previous Irish government?
Yeah, these are really good questions as well. Thanks. So I'm doing another bit of work at the moment. It's about how Irish government deals with things like conflict legacy. So again, it's a good question because it's quite fresh in my mind from looking through Irish government archives recently. I don't particularly think there's much difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael Labour administrations. I mean, overall with the Irish government, there's a slight cosmetic difference in terms of how they publicly announce policies. The Fianna Fáil pretty much did similar things against the Republican movement the Fine Gael Labour did. It's just Fine Gael and Labour, particularly in that period with the coalition that covers partly what we're talking about here, 74, 75, were just a lot more vocal about it. And they were a lot more vocal about it, I think, partly in terms of clamping down on republicanism, things like Offences Against the State Act, broadcasting bans, etc. These actually existed before that administration, but they just broadcast it louder, partly as an attempt to, yeah, I'd say like woo unionists about the Irish government was doing something related to the conflict and was not back in the IRA. So that was partly why it was done publicly. But in terms of intelligence sharing, there's a couple of things interesting on this, like extradition's an interesting thing. So the British government and British forces used to complain about this a lot, about why were people not being extradited from the Republic up to the north. Some of that's because, particularly in the 70s, even British officials didn't really entirely understand the whole Republic of Ireland's constitution business, that there was parts of the constitution that did not allow just the extraditing of people straight away until there was a consideration of whether it was a political offence or not. And that wasn't really that well understood. The second part to this as well is that the Irish government, and the particularly good book on this, if you're interested, is two books, Patrick Moreau's book about Irish security policy in the 70s, and Brian Hanley's book about public opinion in the Republic of Ireland in that period as well. What's interesting, they say, is that also the Irish government was in a little bit of a bargaining game. And I don't necessarily mean in a crude way. You know, say with the Dublin Monaghan bombings in May 1974, those governments had an impression that the UK intelligence, etc., would have an idea of who might have carried these things out. So sometimes they might have held back on extradition or other cases of intelligence sharing because they felt, well, look, you're not playing ball with some of the things for security policy, so we'll hold off. So there's a little bit of a standoff at times. Having said that, Fine Gael Labour, what did happen in their period was something called Baldonnel meetings, where they had discussions about security cooperation and trying to improve it between the RUC and the Gardaí. And that did seem to go somewhere in 1974. So that was a slight alteration, improvement, intelligence sharing. But even again, the problem for the Irish forces was partly a lack of money, and that's to plough into your security forces. They didn't have the kind of reserves and skills that the British forces had. So sometimes the point I'm making there is when sometimes we see complaints in UK security forces is putting all those things in perspective about how the Republic of Ireland operated differently. And there wasn't actually a full-scale conflict in the Republic of Ireland, which there was in Northern Ireland. Again, some British officials, not all of them, but some of them kind of overlooked that at points. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Thomas. I've one here from Alistair. I'm paraphrasing it slightly, but what was the impact of telephone tappings during the period of 69 to 75?
Yeah, this is a good question. So particular things I know about this is, so it worked two ways. In some respects, this was partly done by British forces to try and, particularly in the cities, it seemed to be. I've not come across it so much in documents about countryside, but I'm sure it did happen. In the cities, yeah, there were people they suspected either were in paramilitary groups, the IRA, UDA, UVF, etc. They try and tap their phones in the old-fashioned sense with the ones you'd have in your house with the cord and everything. But what's also interesting is vice versa. So there's a case where I seem to remember this and reading this in Ed Maloney's book with Brendan Hughes, and I seem to remember that that might have been why when Brendan Hughes was arrested the second time after escaping from prison, that there was a phone tapping operation going on by the IRA in Belfast on British forces to find out where they were, which obviously allowed the IRA then to plan attacks slightly as well. So there was a bit of a review after that. I seem to remember reading in archive documents about that kind of thing. But yeah, the phone tapping stuff and that particularly steps up when you get to, say, late 80s into 90s, because you start to get the advent of things like mobile phones, which Republicans begin to use to begin with, but then they realize, yeah, these things can be tapped. So that creates difficulties. But yeah, good question.
And thanks. One final question, and I'm going to, this is one from myself, Thomas, and I'm involved in recording history here from the Irish War of Independence, the Irish Civil War. And I'm just cognizant of some gaps in our knowledge around, the 69 to 75 period. And with your historian's hat on now, what would you do at the moment to protect or to expand that level of history that we can capture at the moment, so that that's going to be available for future generations? Is there anything we can do currently, or the governments can do, or local community or history groups can do to capture that information so it's available into the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's really important as well. I think on the one hand, I mean, obviously people will be aware of this from partly things that have been in the media over the years that, you know, even as researchers, it's difficult, particularly say topics like this, asking people specific things in interviews about specific events, because obviously on all sides, and that includes for UK security forces, Irish security forces, not just Republicans and Loyalists, people, one, got to be careful and also don't want to incriminate themselves and anything. So that's always a tricky thing with this. Having said all that, I still do think, partly what I largely did with my interviews for this work, but also you can see from other academic studies that ultimately there still is the opportunity to ask questions more widely about, okay, how did the conflict affect this area and what happened in these ways and how did that affect everyday life and practices? And not just actually as well from people who are involved in the kind of armed side of the conflict, you know, people who live in their everyday life. That's quite interesting as well. And I do think, like, as you said, the local level point is very important. And maybe actually, as you said, local level, I've always felt that, you know, I know some of the UK government's plans over the years is to have some kind of centralized oral history archive, which to some extent has its uses, but it does then kind of detach from a local experience. I think it might be better to partly maybe via like web forums, etc., but have it more stored and recorded and accessed from local communities. And the advantage of that is partly you can see where I've talked about here, and you know as well, Liam, from the earlier periods in the Irish War of Independence and Civil War, the local experience is really, really important because, as I said, like what's going on in South Armagh is not even the same as what goes on in North Armagh, that goes on in Fermanagh. And then that's even me putting it at a broader county level. If you break that down to towns like Newton Hamilton compared to Crossmaglen, then the experience are really different as well. So I do think the local experience is really important in terms of, yeah, certainly oral histories. That, to me, in a sense, the second, they're a particularly key thing because people are going to pass away from those periods. And they have really interesting insights about what was happening in their areas at that time. I mean, giving you just one example off the top of my head, I remember chatting to some people, you know, in South Armagh that were just children at that point, and they said about, you know, when you go to school and sometimes there might be Republican checkpoints put up, and you got used to that on occasions just happening when you come to or from school. So, you know, these things are interesting. And, you know, I know other people have said about accounts of people who worked in the health service, for example, in Northern Ireland's interesting. And because of there was often, you know, there's a kind of site in the world where there's quite advancements in, say, treatment or things like skin grafting because of the conflict. So it became a kind of hub for practice from around the world. So yeah, I definitely think it's important. I think it's important doing it at local level. And I don't think that there are barriers, as I said, in terms of certain matters can't be discussed for legal reasons, etc. But I do think that if people do want to talk, then there are ways to do it roundabouts, you know, just general questions about the conflict and experience. And that is interesting, even as we said, just talking about conflict, kind of the main points of the conflict, but also there'd be areas where the conflict didn't affect that much. And that's interesting to see how people view the conflict from there. So yeah, key thing to do, I would say. I hope that helps. Why it is.
It does. Thanks so much, Thomas. Thomas, I had a few other questions I didn't get to just in just respect for your time. You've been so generous with your time again. Really, really appreciate it. Can you just remind us again, for those who are watching this, who want to purchase your book, where can it be purchased? Yeah, you can purchase it from Cambridge University Press website, but you can also purchase it on places. If you're in the UK, Amazon will work. Various other bookstores. In the Republic of Ireland, if you just type it into bookstores, it will come up. I can't remember the top. I think Easton sells it at the top of my head. Might have been one, but I might be wrong about that. But there's quite a few places that do. So if you type it in, it will come up. You can also, for example, I have Twitter at I think it's Thomas DM Leahy. So you can always message me on there if you're desperate to find out where to get it from. Like have a look, particularly in the Republic, because I know it's a little bit different there with buying things like this. So yeah, but yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the time, and thanks for turning up on a Wednesday night. Much appreciated as well. Thanks so much, Thomas. Chat again. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.